Okay, here's a short burst of Theresa May talking in Florence last week.
We have recognised from the outset there are unique issues to consider when it comes to Northern Ireland.
And this is the sound of someone scraping fingernails against a blackboard. Hard to tell the difference? Theresa May...
We will no longer sit at the European Council table or in the Council of Ministers.
Fingernails against a blackboard. No, stop! Not the fingernail scratching, the bit before where Theresa May was talking for 40 minutes last week, and she said nothing at all about the plans for Brexit, except for the fact she wants to kick the can down the road for another 2 years. And yet here we are talking generalities. Nobody is talking about the detail, and there is so much detail on Brexit. So I thought we'd have a go at providing some detail today. This is groundbreaking stuff, I tell you. In particular, how Theresa May has given herself Henry VIII powers, which is not a good thing. I mean, she can burn down churches and behead spouses. But worse than that, she can decide for herself how laws should be determined, because there are laws and then there are regulations. So actually, she's determining the regulation part of it, but a lot of it seems like law. Confused? Here's a man who can't pronounce the letter R telling us the difference between law and regulations.
The difference between laws and regulations, really, conceptually, I think it's this. Laws are there for the protection of property rights or rights in general. You know, regulations primarily regulate economic activities. Let's think of this in terms of economic activity.
Okay, so he's going to be no help whatsoever, isn't he? But so here's a simple explanation instead. A law is a set of rules. Regulation contains the definition around those rules, which might change over time. So a law, for example, might say that we want speed limits on our roads. Regulations will then determine how fast you can go. So you don't need to rewrite the law when you say you want the A3 around Guildford to be a 50 zone instead of a 60 zone. The law might say that it should be applying to everyone. So you'd have to go and change the law if you wanted it mandatory that older people should drive a bit faster and don't dilly-dally quite so much, for example. And why don't we change that law? That sounds like a good one. So that's the difference. Laws are pretty much set in concrete till they get changed. Regulations can change almost to the drop of a hat, provided it makes sense. And sometimes there's a bit of consultation that goes on, but very often it's just determined by the bureaucrats. So that sounds fine, doesn't it, in examples like that? Except with the Great Repeal Bill, just about everything that's been developed as law under the EU will now be treated as a regulation, which means the details can be changed without changing the law, which means without passing through Parliament. You know, that whole tedious process called democracy. So why wouldn't we all be looking through the existing EU laws and regulations to see what the Tory party can now change all by themselves? And that really depends on what you're interested in, because there are so many laws and regulations. But let's start with one as an example: animal welfare. So, for example, the EU rules say anyone transporting animals must be based in an EU country. So does that mean we change it and say, look, if you're transporting animals, shipping them overseas, for example, you must be a company based in the UK now rather than the EU, which sort of limits the universe of companies that can provide that service? Or do we remove that rule totally and say that, the country that we're sending the animals to could provide the transporter rather than someone in the EU? In other words, do we say, look, it could be a dodgy transport company from overseas. We don't really care. We're just going to write out that EU law. The EU law also says the transporter should have no record of serious breaches of EU animal protection rules during the last 3 years. Do we get rid of that one and say, well, look, if they're guilty of neglecting the EU, then obviously they can't transport animals in the EU, but that's fine. Come over and do it in Britain. We don't care. That is just a couple of lines out of one piece of regulation, of which there are thousands. So how do we untangle this? Are we really happy for those decisions to be made by a minister at the stroke of a pen without any government involvement and no public consultation? If you're concerned about animal rights, would you be concerned that that sort of thing changes without you even knowing about it? Well, you might not care too much about animal rights, but there are thousands and thousands of regulations and laws across a whole variety of subjects with minute detail that government ministers will now be able to unilaterally determine. Like, for example, airport landing slots. There's an agreement on how that works across Europe. Are we going to have some junior bureaucrat determining how those airport landing slots are going to be worked out for the UK now, and perhaps starting some big tit-for-tat war between the airlines? There's a whole bunch of tax avoidance measures. Are we just going to be happy for those tax avoidance measures to disappear, or perhaps enacted in a different way by a Tory party that, potentially could be looking after the wealthy? There's over 700 regulations on the environment, health protection. Does a minister make an arbitrary decision about chlorinated chickens, for example, with no public vote, no public consultation, or rules on clinical trials for drugs or cosmetics or fertilizers, labeling laws? That is a massive job in itself. Do we care about the labeling laws that have been established, many of them, many thousands of them really, during the time we've been in the EU? Do we just take all those labeling laws off? Or do we have them arbitrarily changed by somebody who perhaps could have been influenced by the food industry? Is taking back control, does that really mean we take it from European bureaucrats and push it to unelected bureaucrats in Whitehall, who are setting up the directives from a minister who doesn't need to consult anyone? Or are we better with laws that were at least voted on by the European Parliament? That is the thing. There was a vote in Europe. We had MEPs. Nigel Farage was one of them, even though he rarely showed up to vote at the European Parliament. So here's the ironic thing. Here's a man who complains about Europe being unrepresentative, and that's because he rarely showed up. He had the worst attendance record. Actually, I think there was an Irish MEP who was seriously ill, who's the only one who had a worse attendance record than Nigel Farage. There's a website where you can track all this. Go to votewatch.eu and type in Nigel Farage's name. You'll find out that he turned out for about 35-40% of the votes. Normally, he was voting for budgets. He voted against Jean-Claude Juncker's appointment. Well, fair enough on that one. But any actual laws, well, he showed pretty much singular disinterest. So don't you find that whole thing a bit ironic? Too much detail for him to consider, perhaps. So it is the irony, isn't it? In our rush to take back control from a situation where we had votes but invariably didn't use them because we had this man there who was just taking all the money and complaining about it, we've handed power to Whitehall bureaucrats with no democratic control. And Brexiteers seem to think it's all very simple. Well, it is if you take out any semblance of detail. Then it is all very simple, isn't it? But if you're looking at the minutiae of the laws and regulations which have been built up over years that we now have to recreate, are we really happy to see that being handed to bureaucrats in Whitehall without any votes? It may be because we do not seem capable of dealing with the detail, which is why Theresa May spent 40 minutes saying nothing at all last week.
Balls Radio of the UK. From a Brexit Britain to the world.
God help us all.